My name is Louise Burke. I'm 31 years old. And 3 days after I stepped off a C-17 at Pope Army Airfield, returning from a 9-month deployment to Poland, my older sister, Brooks Burke, looked me in the eye and told me that if I didn't hand over $200,000 of my lottery winnings, I was dead to this family. She didn't say it in private. She said it at a Sunday dinner table in Columbus, Ohio, in front of a pastor my mother had invited specifically to shame me into doing what they wanted. By the time the coffee was served, the woman crying wasn't me, even though I was the one being treated like a criminal for finally having a future of my own. My sister had already used my 7-year-old niece, Harper Reed, as a way to get to me, coaching her to ask me over the phone why I didn't love them anymore. All because I refused to pay for a decade of her financial failures. This is what happens when the people who are supposed to welcome you home from service decide that your sacrifice is actually just a blank check for their debts. I know how hard it can be when the people you trust most turn your success into a reason to hurt you. If this story is hitting home for you, please take a second to like and subscribe to the channel. Now let me take you back. I've spent the last 9 years as a captain in the U.S. Army's JAG Corps, working as a legal assistance attorney at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, which means my entire life is built on rules, evidence, and the kind of precision that doesn't leave room for luck. I don't play the lottery because I'm the kind of person who tracks every cent in a spreadsheet and carries a Ziploc bag of almonds in my flight suit so I don't have to spend money on base snacks. But that Tuesday evening in March, shortly after I'd returned from Operation Atlantic Resolve, I stopped to fill up my tank at a speedway just outside Westerville on my way to see my parents. And there was a Mega Millions sign on the counter showing a number that felt like a joke. I had $2 in change in my pocket, so I bought a ticket, tucked it into my wallet next to my military ID, and forgot about it until 4 days later when I was sitting in my kitchen staring at my phone screen and checking the numbers for the 6th time. I hadn't won the jackpot, but I had won $2 million, which, after the IRS took their share, left me with about $740,000 in my account. It was enough to finally stop renting a cramped apartment in Fayetteville, enough to think about a real home with a yard, and enough to breathe for the first time since I commissioned. The very first thing I did before calling a financial advisor or even my commanding officer was call my mother, Elise Burke, the woman who had spent my entire childhood telling me that the Army was a mistake because it took me away from home. When she picked up, her voice was thin and tired, the way it always is when she's been listening to my father complain about the neighbors. But when I told her the news, she screamed so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. I could hear her shouting into the next room for my father, Silas Burke, telling him that I had won the lottery. And for a few minutes, I felt a warmth in my chest that had been missing for years because it felt like I finally belonged to them again. Within an hour, my father called me, his voice sounding deeper and more affectionate than I'd heard it since my high school graduation, telling me he was proud of me. And those were 3 words I'd been chasing across 3 different continents. Then my older sister, Brooks Burke, called, sounding sweet and overwhelmed with joy, suggesting that we all needed to celebrate with a big family dinner as soon as possible. She asked me how much the total was after taxes, and because I was still caught up in the relief of being home and being loved, I told her the exact number. For about 2 hours, I actually believed that good news could just be good news in this family. But that was the most expensive feeling I've ever had. The shift didn't take long to happen, and it started on Wednesday morning while I was back at my desk at Fort Liberty, trying to catch up on a mountain of legal filings. My mother called me with that casual rhythmic tone she uses when she's about to ask for a favor but wants you to think it's your own idea, mentioning that the roof on the family house in Ohio had started leaking again. The estimate was $15,000, and she sighed into the phone, wondering aloud if it wouldn't be wonderful to finally have that fixed, so she wouldn't have to put buckets in the hallway every time it rained. I told her I'd think about it, but by Thursday, the requests turned into demands when my father called me without any small talk at all. He didn't ask how my reintegration was going or if I was still having trouble sleeping after the deployment. He just reminded me of the double shifts he worked so I could go to college. The reality was that his double shifts paid for my sister's cheerleading camps and a boat he eventually sold at a loss. while my education was paid for by a ROTC scholarship and the GI Bill. But I didn't correct him because I didn't want to start a fight. By Thursday night, the sweetness in my sister's voice had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp urgency that felt like a physical weight through the phone. She told me she needed $200,000 because she and her husband, Jackson Reed, were drowning in credit card debt and a mortgage they couldn't afford on his salary as a HVAC technician. When I told her that was more than a quarter of everything I had and that I needed time to process the request, she told me that if I said no, I shouldn't bother showing up for Sunday dinner. I sat in my dark living room in North Carolina, holding my phone and realizing that 3 days ago, I was just a daughter who was gone too often. But now that I had a check, the whole family had a claim on my life. I didn't know yet how organized that claim was about to get, but I could feel the air in the room getting colder. Friday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Pastor Thomas Sterling from my mother's church in Columbus, telling me that my mother had reached out to him because she was concerned about my heart. He wrote about how generosity is a blessing and that he hoped I would pray on the situation, and I realized then that my mother had already taken our private business to the pulpit. But it wasn't just the church. My sister had been busy calling every extended relative we had, including my Aunt Sarah and my Uncle Marcus, making sure everyone knew her version of the story. The version where I was the greedy officer who had forgotten where she came from as soon as she got a little bit of money. The message that actually broke me came from my grandmother, Evelyn Burke, who was 81 years old and had always been my sanctuary. She sent me a short text saying she was disappointed in me and I had to sit down on the floor of the JAG office because the pain of her judgment felt worse than anything I'd experienced in the field. My sister had even posted in our family Facebook group about how blood doesn't mean anything to some people when money shows up, and the comments were filled with supportive messages for her and silent daggers for me. I realized then that they had more than just emotional leverage over me because 2 years ago, I had co-signed a loan for my father's Ford F-150 when his credit was too low to get approved. If he decided to stop making payments out of spite, my own credit score would crater, making it impossible for me to buy the house I'd been dreaming of during my long nights in Poland. My mother was also still listed as a co-holder on my old savings account from back in 2019 when I'd set it up to help her manage her bills. And I knew she could walk into a branch and empty it whenever she felt like it. They had me trapped in a corner I hadn't even realized I'd built for myself over the years of trying to be the good daughter who provided for everyone. That night, I opened my laptop and started doing what I do best. I looked at the numbers and I didn't look away until I saw the truth. I sat at my small kitchen table in Fayetteville, the kind of place that's functional but never really felt like a home because I was always preparing for the next set of PCS orders, and I pulled up my bank statements from USAA going back 5 years. As a JAG officer, I deal with evidence every day. But I had never turned that clinical eye toward my own family until that Friday night. And as I cross-referenced Venmo transfers and wire receipts, the picture that emerged was a document of my own exploitation. In March 2019, I had wired $30,000 to my sister, Brooks Burke, when she and her husband separated for the first time. And I still have the saved message where she swore she would pay me back every cent once she found her footing. She never did, and I never asked because that's what we were taught family does. We absorb the blow so the other person doesn't have to feel the ground. Then there was June 2021, when I spent $18,000 to buy my father's Ford F-150 outright because he couldn't get a loan, and he told me we'd figure out a repayment plan that never once made it into a conversation again. The numbers kept climbing as I scrolled through 2022, finding the $22,000 I paid directly to a hospital in Columbus for my mother's knee surgery, because their insurance was a joke, and I remember her telling me that it was a daughter's duty to care for her parents. Finally, there was October 2023, when I was already preparing for the rotation to Poland, and I covered 6 months of rent, $17,000, for my sister's apartment when she left her husband again, only for her to move back in with him 3 months later without a single word about the money I'd spent. I stared at the bottom of the spreadsheet where the total sat in a cold, black font, $87,000. I had never seen it as one number before, always thinking of it as separate favors or small gifts. But looking at that total, something shifted inside me that went beyond being a daughter or a sister. I wasn't even angry yet. I was just awake, realizing that I had been funding their stability at the expense of my own, and now they were demanding even more of the future I had actually earned. Have you ever been the person in your family who everyone calls when they're in trouble, but no one calls just to see how you're doing? If you felt that weight, drop a comment and let me know I'm not the only one. Now, back to the story. The real math of the situation didn't truly hit me until Saturday afternoon at 2:14 p.m. when my phone rang and I saw my sister's name on the screen. But when I answered, it wasn't the voice of a grown woman. It was my 7-year-old niece, Harper Reed, and her voice was small and shaking, the kind of sound that makes your heart stop because you know a child shouldn't have to feel that kind of pressure. She asked me if it was true that I didn't love them anymore. And when I asked her why she would say that, she told me through tears that her mommy was crying because I was being selfish with my money. I closed my eyes and leaned against my kitchen counter, feeling a coldness wash over me that I had never felt even during the winter months in Eastern Europe. Because my sister had done the one thing I thought was beneath her. She had used a child who still believes in fairy tales to try and break the spirit of someone who had spent the last decades serving her country. And in that moment, something in me was damaged past the point of repair. I told my niece that I loved her more than anything, and that would never change. But as soon as the call ended, I picked up the phone and called Mia Drummond, my old roommate from the Ohio State University, who was now a family law attorney in Columbus. I told her I needed her to be at my parents' house on Sunday at 4:30. And when she asked me if I was sure I wanted to bring a lawyer to a family dinner, I told her I wasn't going to a dinner, I was going to a closing. I spent the rest of the evening ignoring calls from my sister, who eventually sent a flat transactional text asking if I'd thought about the $200,000, and when I replied that my answer was no, she told me she would make sure my niece knew exactly why her aunt chose a bank account over her family. I didn't even reply to the threat. I just sat there while my dinner went cold on the stove, feeling the silence of my apartment grow heavier with every passing minute. About 20 minutes after my sister's last text, a new message popped up from a number that rarely contacted me directly, belonging to my brother-in-law, Jackson Reed. It was just 6 words. I'm sorry about all of this. I read it twice, wondering if it was a trap or a genuine moment of clarity from a man who had spent the last 7 years watching my sister hold court at the head of every table while he quietly loaded the dishwasher in the background. I didn't know what to do with that information yet, so I filed it away in the same part of my brain where I keep things that don't quite add up on a balance sheet, and I went to bed knowing that the next day would be the hardest of my life. Saturday morning at 8:07 a.m., my father's name lit up the screen, and I knew the time exactly because Silas Burke never calls before noon unless he's angry or someone is in the hospital. He didn't say hello or ask how I was doing. He just delivered a command in the same tone he used when I was a kid, and I'd tracked mud onto his clean floors, telling me that I would give my sister what she asked for. When I told him that isn't how things work and reminded him that I had paid for my own college through the Army, the silence on the other end of the line was the longest and loudest thing I had ever heard from him. He eventually told me to be at the house for dinner and to bring a better attitude, and when he hung up, I realized I was shaking, not because I was afraid of him, but because the sky hadn't fallen after I finally stood my ground. I called Mia Drummond one last time to confirm she was ready, and then I opened the spreadsheet and printed out every single page, totaling $87,000 of proof that I had already given enough. I put the pages into a plain brown folder and set it by my front door, right next to my patrol cap. And I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to remember the girl I was before I learned that loving my family meant letting them take everything I had. I thought about my father losing his machinist job 5 years ago and how he'd spent his days watching his younger daughter become more stable than he'd ever been. And I realized his anger was just a cover for his own shame. But understanding why someone is hurting you doesn't mean you have to let them keep doing it. And as I drove toward my parents' house, I knew that the version of me that always said yes was staying behind in the rearview mirror. The sky over the Columbus suburbs was that particular shade of bruised orange you only see in central Ohio during the tail end of March. the kind of weather that feels like it's waiting for a storm that never quite arrives. I pulled into the gravel driveway of the brick ranch where I grew up, and the first thing I saw was the 2017 Ford F-150 I had bought for my father, parked right in front of the garage like a monument to a debt he never intended to acknowledge. Mia Drummond was already there, waiting in her car with a leather satchel and the kind of quiet, professional stillness that reminded me why we had been such good friends since our days at The Ohio State University. She stepped out, smoothing her blazer, and as we walked toward the front door, I felt the weight of the brown folder in my hand, knowing that inside those pages was the only voice I had left in a house that had spent 30 years trying to drown me out. My mother, Elise Burke, opened the door before we could even knock, wearing her best floral blouse and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, which snapped immediately to the woman standing beside me. She asked who my friend was with a thin, sharp edge to her voice, and when I introduced my guest as a lawyer, I watched the color drain from her face just before she turned and disappeared back into the hallway. The house smelled like pot roast and floor wax, the heavy, suffocating sense of a Sunday afternoon that was supposed to be about family but felt more like a deposition. I stepped into the dining room and saw that they had already set the table with 7 places, and they had positioned my chair directly across from my father, Silas Burke, so that I would have to look at him while they told me how much I owed them for the life they gave me. My father was already seated at the head of the table, his hands flat on the lace tablecloth, looking every bit the retired machinist who had spent his life demanding respect without ever figuring out how to earn it. To his right was my older sister, Brooks Burke, who had her chin tilted up and fresh mascara applied like she was preparing for a performance. And next to her was her husband, Jackson Reed, who looked like he wanted to crawl into the floorboards. At the far end of the table sat my Aunt Sarah, who had always been the quietest member of the family. And next to her was Pastor Thomas Sterling, who had his Bible resting on his knee as if he were preparing to deliver a sentence rather than a prayer. They had set up a small folding chair in the corner for my friend, and she took her seat without a word, opening her satchel and pulling out a notepad while the rest of my family stared at her as if she were a ghost that had crashed their dinner party. Nobody served the food even though the pot roast was steaming in the center of the table. And my father didn't waste any time with a blessing or a hello. He just leaned forward and told me that we were all there because they were worried about the path I was taking. My mother reached out and touched the arm of the man from the church, and he cleared his throat, his voice sounding practiced and smooth as he spoke about the sanctity of family and the blessing of an unexpected harvest. He told me that my mother was concerned that the money I'd won was changing who I was, and that the most honorable thing I could do as a daughter and a servant of the country was to ensure that those who raised me were taken care of. I sat there in silence, feeling the familiar hum of the military, bearing I'd practiced for a decade, and I realized that they had invited this man here not to guide me, but to use the things I believed in to make me feel small enough to hand over my future. I looked at my sister, who was watching me with a look of pure, unadulterated entitlement, and then I looked at my father, whose jaw was set in that hard, stubborn line I had feared since I was a little girl. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't reach for the food. I just took the brown folder and set it on the table right next to the breadbasket, and I watched as every eye in the room followed the movement. I asked my sister a single question: how much she thought she had given me in the last 31 years, and when she started to stutter about how that wasn't the point, I turned the same question toward the man at the head of the table. My father told me they had given me a roof and a name, and my mother began to cry, accusing me of keeping score after everything they had sacrificed to put me through school and keep me safe while I was away. I looked at the woman who used to braid my hair and told her that I never wanted to keep score, but that they were the ones who had forced me to start counting. I opened the folder, and the room went so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a stark contrast to the loud, chaotic arguments that usually filled this house during the holidays. I pulled out the first page, a confirmation of the $30,000 I'd wired to my sister back in March 2019. And I read the details out loud with the same clinical precision I would use in a JAG briefing at Fort Liberty. I showed them the text message where my sister had sworn on her daughter's life that she would pay me back. And then I watched as my friend quietly stood up and placed a copy of that message in front of the man from the church. He looked down at the paper, and then he looked at my mother. And for the first time that evening, the smooth, practiced look on his face began to flicker with something that looked like doubt. I moved to the next page, detailing the $17,000 I'd spent on rent for my sister's apartment in October 2023 while I was preparing to ship out to Poland, money she had accepted while promising to make it up to me. My sister's face was turning a deep, blotchy red, and she started to shout about how that was a private matter and that I had no right to bring a lawyer into a family home to discuss things that were meant to be handled with love. I didn't respond to the shouting. I just kept turning the pages, moving through the $18,000 for the truck sitting in the driveway and the $22,000 for the surgery that allowed my mother to walk without pain. By the time I reached the final summary page, the atmosphere in the room had shifted from a trial of my character to a mounting evidence of their own greed. And I laid the total flat on the table for everyone to see. $87,000. That was the price of being a good daughter in the Burke family. And as I looked around the table, I realized that the man from the church was no longer looking at me with judgment. He was looking at the people who had brought him there to do their dirty work. My father was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white, but he didn't have a word to say because the truck he drove every day was the only answer he had. And it wasn't enough to pay for the silence he wanted. The only sound in the room was the low, electric hum of the refrigerator and the distant, muffled shouting of a commentator on the television in the other room, a noise that felt like it belonged to a different world than the one currently collapsing around this table. I looked at my mother, the woman who had spent my entire deployment to Poland telling me how much she missed me, and I saw her eyes darting between the folder and the man from the church, searching for a way to turn the narrative back to my supposed greed. My father's younger sister, Sarah Burke, was the first one to break the heavy stillness. And when she finally spoke, her voice wasn't the quiet, hesitant thing I'd grown up with, but something sharp and tired. She looked directly at her brother and asked him how he could sit there and demand more from me when he still owed her $12,000 from a loan he'd taken out in 2018 and never mentioned again. The air in the room seemed to vanish as she spoke, revealing that the man who had always been the final authority in my life was just a man who had been running from his own failures for years. I watched my father's face and saw the vein in his temple pulse once, a sign that he was cornered, and for the first time in 31 years, I realized that the fear I had carried for him was something he had built out of shadows and secrets. Thomas Sterling took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, looking down at the text message screenshots my friend had placed in front of him with a look of profound realization that made the room feel even smaller. He turned to my mother and told her, with a voice that was calm but carried the weight of a final judgment, that she had brought him here under false pretenses by telling him I was being selfish. He said he had come to this house to help a family find their way back to a path of kindness and love. But all he found was a list of debts that had been ignored in favor of finding a new person to take from. My mother reached out for his arm, her voice trembling as she tried to explain that it was more complicated than a few pieces of paper, but the man just shook his head and stood up, picking up his Bible from his knee. He looked at me, and I didn't see the pity I expected. I saw a flicker of the same respect I get from my senior NCOs when a difficult decision is executed with integrity. He apologized to me for coming into this house with only half the truth, and then he walked out the front door, leaving a silence behind him that felt heavier than any argument we had ever had in 30 years. The front door clicked shut, and the sound seemed to trigger something in my sister, who slammed her palm onto the lace tablecloth so hard the silverware rattled against the plates. My sister Brooks didn't take the defeat quietly. She shouted that this was a private matter and that I had no right to humiliate our parents in their own home by bringing a lawyer and a spreadsheet to a Sunday dinner. She spoke as if my preparation was a betrayal of the family bond. But I just looked at her and reminded her that she was the one who made it public when she went to the church and the family group on Facebook to paint me as a villain. I told her that I wasn't there for a fight and I wasn't asking for a single dollar back, but that the days of me being the family's backup plan while I was serving thousands of miles away were officially over. My father didn't look at me. He just pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the linoleum like a blade, and he walked down the hallway and closed the bedroom door without saying a single word. It was the quietest thing I'd ever seen him do, and it felt like the final piece of the life I used to know was finally being put away for good. My mother didn't follow him at first. She stood there looking at the cold pot roast and the empty chair where the man from the church had sat, her hands shaking as she gripped her napkin. Then she turned and went into the kitchen and started running the water, a frantic, rhythmic sound of plates clinking together that told me she was already trying to wash away the reality of what had just happened. That left the five of us, my sister, her husband, my aunt, my friend, and me, sitting in a room that felt like the aftermath of a wreck that had finally cleared the road. My sister started to cry, but they weren't the tears she had practiced earlier. They were messy and real. The kind of crying that comes when you realize the person you've been using isn't going to let you do it anymore. She told me I had ruined the family, but then her husband, Jackson Reed, did something I never thought I'd see from the man who usually stayed in the background of every family crisis. He looked at his wife and told her that I hadn't ruined anything. And then he revealed the one secret she had been trying to keep from everyone, including the parents who were currently hiding in the other room. He told the table that they were $42,000 in credit card debt and that the $200,000 she wanted from me wasn't for a mortgage or a future. It was to keep her from having to admit she had been lying to everyone for years. My sister stared at him as if he were a stranger, and I realized that by standing up for myself, I had given the man she was married to the permission he needed to finally stop carrying her secrets. I sat there and watched as the truth finished what the money had started, and as I picked up the folder and prepared to leave, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who had something to be ashamed of in this house. I walked out of that brick ranch with my friend, Mia Drummond, and the silence of the Ohio night felt like a heavy blanket being lifted off my shoulders. We sat in her car for a long time before she even turned the key, the heater humming against the late March chill that always seems to linger in Columbus longer than it's welcome. She didn't ask me if I was okay because as a lawyer and a friend, she knew that okay wasn't the right word for the feeling of watching your own family come apart over a spreadsheet of their own making. I looked at the dark windows of my parents' house, thinking about my father sitting behind that closed bedroom door and my mother scrubbing plates that were already clean, and I realized that I had spent my entire career in the Army learning how to manage conflict, but nothing had prepared me for the quiet devastation of finally winning a fight I never wanted to have. We drove back to my apartment in silence, passing the speedway where I had bought that ticket, and I realized that the money wasn't a blessing or a curse. It was just a light that had finally been turned on in a very dark room. Monday morning at 9:15 a.m., I walked into the First Federal Credit Union on Broad Street, still wearing my Army combat uniform because I had to head back to Fort Liberty later that afternoon. The teller, a woman who had seen me come in with my mother for years, looked at my face and then at the paperwork I placed on the counter, her expression shifting into something professional and guarded. I told her I needed to remove my name from the joint savings account I held with my mother, Elise Burke, effectively cutting the last financial cord that allowed her to see into my life. It took 20 minutes of clicking keys and signing forms, a clinical process that felt like a surgery I should have had years ago. And when I walked back out into the wind, I felt a physical lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt since before my deployment to Poland. One down. Tuesday was about the truck, the 2017 Ford F-15. Oh, that sat in my father's driveway like a blue chrome reminder of the $18,000 I had spent to keep him on the road. I called the bank and initiated the paperwork to refinance the loan, a process that would require my father, Silas Burke, to either take over the debt himself or find a new co-signer within 90 days. I knew the bank would likely deny him based on his history, but I also knew that as a JAG officer, I couldn't afford to have my credit tied to a man who had used our relationship as a bargaining chip for a sister's bad decisions. The loan officer told me they would need the primary borrower's cooperation, and I told him that I had provided the address and the phone number and that the rest was a matter of law. I wasn't doing it to be cruel. I was doing it because I had spent a decade protecting a country that I was now realizing I needed to protect myself from. By Wednesday, the silence from the house in Columbus was absolute, but the town itself was beginning to talk. Because in a small place like ours, information travels through the church parking lot faster than any social media post. My father's younger sister, Sarah Burke, called me to tell me that my mother had spent the better part of the week telling anyone who would listen that I had humiliated them in their own home. My mother told the neighbors that the army had made me cold, that I had returned from my rotation in Eastern Europe with a heart made of stone, and that I was punishing my family for being less fortunate than I was. It was a classic move, turning my service into a weapon to be used against my character. But for the first time in my life, the guilt didn't find a place to land. I told my aunt that I loved my mother, but that I was no longer willing to pay for the privilege of being her daughter. And then I hung up and went back to my work at the legal assistance office. Thursday afternoon, a letter arrived at my apartment. Not an email or a text, but a handwritten envelope with a shaky, elegant cursive that I recognized immediately as belonging to my grandmother, Evelyn Burke. She was the woman who had taught me that a person's word is the only thing they truly own. And as I opened the letter, I prepared myself for another lecture on the importance of family loyalty. Instead, she wrote that she had heard only one side of the story until the pastor had stopped by her house to check on her, and that she was sorry for judging me before she had the facts. She wrote that my grandfather would have been proud of the way I stood my ground at that table, and she asked me to come see her when I was ready to talk without the weight of the rest of the family between us. I sat at my kitchen table and cried for the first time all week, not because of the pain of the dinner, but because one person in that family had looked at the truth and chose me over the lie. Friday evening, my brother-in-law, Jackson Reed, sent me a message that was much longer than his previous 6 words, telling me that he and my sister had entered marriage counseling after the explosion at the dinner table. He told me that he had finally told the counselor about the $42,000 in credit card debt and the way my sister had coached their daughter, Harper Reed, to call me and cry about money. He said he was tired of living in a house built on secrets, and even though he wasn't sure if their marriage would survive the honesty, he wanted me to know that he was sorry for his silence during the years when I was being drained. I didn't have the words to tell him that his silence had been a part of the problem, so I just thanked him for the information and told him to give my niece a hug from me. I realized then that my decision to stand up for myself hadn't just changed my own life. It had cracked the foundation of every lie that held the rest of them together, and the debris was still falling. The following Sunday, my mother attended the morning service at her church, sitting in the 3rd pew as she had for 30 years, waiting for the comfort of a community that she thought would back her up. But Thomas Sterling didn't give a sermon about the duties of children. He gave a sermon about the sin of using generosity as a leash to control the people you claim to love. He didn't use any names, but as he spoke about how true giving shouldn't come with a hidden price tag, my mother stood up, grabbed her floral purse, and walked out of the sanctuary while the congregation watched in a silence that was louder than any hymn. My aunt told me later that you could hear the pew creak as she left. A final public signal that the narrative my mother had spent a lifetime building was no longer a sanctuary she could hide in. I was 300 miles away in North Carolina when it happened, but I felt the shift in the air all the same, knowing that the truth had finally traveled further than the guilt. 3 months after that Sunday dinner, the refinance on my father's Ford F-15 finally went through. And the day the bank confirmed my name had been removed from the loan was the day I finally felt like I could walk through the PX at Fort Liberty without looking over my shoulder. My credit score, which I had guarded as carefully as my security clearance, remained intact, allowing me to finally move forward with the one thing I'd been dreaming about during the long, cold nights in Poland. I spent my weekends driving through the neighborhoods of Fayetteville, looking at houses that weren't temporary stops or rental units, but places where I could actually plant something and watch it grow. I eventually found a 2-bedroom Cape Cod on Elm Street with a small front porch and a yard that needed work. But when I stood in the kitchen and saw the way the light hit the floor, I knew it was mine. I didn't post a single picture on Facebook, and I didn't send out a mass text to the family group. I just signed the closing documents with a black ace pen and took the keys, feeling a quiet satisfaction that didn't need an audience to be real. Let me pause and ask you, have you ever finally reached a goal you worked years for, only to realize the people you wanted to celebrate with were the ones you had to leave behind? If you've ever had a bittersweet win, share it with me in the comments. Now back to the story. I didn't tell my parents about the house, but in a town like Fayetteville, word has a way of finding its own path. And it wasn't long before my mother called to tell me she had heard I was moving on without the family. Every conversation with my mother, Elise Burke, followed the same exhausting pattern where she would start with the weather in Ohio, before sliding into a sigh about how things used to be before the lottery ticket changed everything. She told me my father, Silas Burke, spent most of his days sitting on the front porch staring at the truck I had bought him, and that he hadn't mentioned my name in weeks, which she framed as a tragedy I had caused rather than a choice he was making. I told her that I loved her and that the door to my new home was unlocked, but that I wouldn't apologize for having a life that didn't involve being a bank account for my sister's credit card debt. She would usually hang up after that, leaving me in the silence of my new living room, wondering if the man who raised me would ever be able to see me as a person instead of a provider. My sister, Brooks Burke, remained completely silent, which was perhaps the loudest thing she had ever done in my 31 years of knowing her. But I received regular updates from my brother-in-law, Jackson Reed. He told me that the marriage counseling was difficult and that they were still trying to figure out how to pay off the $42,000 they owed without dragging anyone else into the hole with them. He also told me that my niece, Harper Reed, kept a photo of me in her room and that she asked about Auntie Louise every time they passed a National Guard armory or saw a soldier in uniform. It hurt to know I was missing those small moments, the zoo trips, and the ice cream runs, but I also knew that if I went back now, I would be teaching her that it's okay to let people treat you poorly as long as they're family. I sent her a birthday card in May with a small gift and a note telling her I loved her. And Jackson texted me a photo of her holding it with a smile that made the 300 miles between us feel like 3,000. The most surprising visit came in June, when my brother-in-law drove down to North Carolina with my niece for a weekend, telling my sister he was taking the girl to see a water park but stopping at my new house instead. He brought a heavy toolbox and spent 4 hours tightening the loose handles on my cabinets and fixing the leaky faucet in my bathroom without me even asking him to do it. While he worked, I sat on the floor of the empty spare bedroom with my niece, and she told me she was sorry for what she had said on the phone back in March. She said her mommy told her that I was going away because I was mad. And I had to look into those 7-year-old eyes and tell her that I wasn't mad at her, and that sometimes grown-ups just need their own space to be okay. We spent the afternoon eating Wendy's on the front porch, and for a few hours, the world felt like it was supposed to feel, before the weight of the secrets they were carrying had to go back to Ohio. Before they left, my brother-in-law stood in my driveway and looked at the small Cape Cod house, and he told me that he finally understood why I had fought so hard at that dinner table. He said he spent his whole life thinking that being a good man meant keeping the peace at any cost. But watching me stand up to my father and my sister had made him realize that peace without truth isn't really peace at all. It's just a slow way to disappear. He didn't ask me for money, and he didn't ask me to call my sister. He just thanked me for being the only person who had ever been honest with him about the mess they were in. As I watched his minivan pull away, I realized that I hadn't just saved my own future that night. I had given a man I barely knew the courage to start saving his own. And that was worth more than any lottery prize. I spent that evening sitting on my porch, watching the fireflies come out over the North Carolina pines, thinking about the $87,000 I would likely never see again, and the family I might never fully get back. I realized that I wasn't waiting for an apology from my father anymore, because I knew he didn't have the words for it, and expecting him to change was just another way of letting him control my happiness. I had my own home, my own career in the JAG Corps, and a version of myself that was no longer shrinking, so that my parents could feel tall in a house built on my labor. The silence from Ohio was still there, but it no longer felt like a threat. It just felt like the space I needed to finally become the woman I was always meant to be. The summer heat in North Carolina is a physical presence, a thick, humid weight that settles over the pines of Fort Liberty long before the sun even finishes rising over the barracks. I started my mornings at 05:30, running the trails near Simmons Army Airfield, letting the steady rhythm of my boots on the gravel drown out the lingering voices from that dinner table in Columbus. As a captain in the JAG Corps, my days are filled with people in crisis. Young private first classes who got into bad car loans, sergeants dealing with messy divorces, and soldiers whose families back home see their steady paycheck as a communal resource. I found myself sitting across from a 20-year-old specialist last week who was nearly in tears because his mother had spent his entire deployment savings on a new SUV without asking him. And I realized then that my story wasn't a freak accident of luck. It was a pattern of behavior that thrives on the silence of people who are too tired or too ashamed to say that enough is enough. And as I walked him through the legal steps to protect his future, I felt like I was finally using my rank for something more than just filing paperwork. I spent my Saturday afternoons working on the garden of my Cape Cod house, pulling weeds from the flower beds and painting the trim a crisp, clean white that made the whole place look like it actually belonged to someone who intended to stay. I didn't have much furniture yet, just a comfortable couch, a solid kitchen table, and the folder of bank statements that I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk as a reminder of what it cost to buy my freedom. My father, Silas Burke, still hadn't called me, but my Aunt Sarah told me that he had started avoiding the Speedway on the corner and the Kroger on Main Street because he didn't want to run into anyone who might ask about his younger daughter. She said he looked older, a man who had built his entire identity on being the one who provided, only to realize that the person who actually provided was the one he had tried to break. It was a quiet, localized kind of shame that lived in the way he parked that Ford F-150 in the back of the driveway instead of the front. And while I didn't take any joy in his embarrassment, I no longer felt the need to rush back and fix it for him. The most difficult part of the transition wasn't the silence from my father, but the way my mother, Elise Burke, continued to use my service as a way to explain away my boundaries to anyone who would listen in our small town. She had told the ladies at her church group that the Army had changed me, that the 9 months I spent in Poland had turned me into someone who valued the mission over the people who raised me. She framed my refusal to pay off my sister's $42,000 of debt as a failure of character, a sign that the military had stripped away the sweet girl I used to be and replaced her with a woman who only understood rules and regulations. This was the most painful thing she could have done, because it suggested that my sacrifice for my country was the very thing that made me unlovable to my family, turning my pride into a liability in their eyes. I realized then that they didn't want the version of me that was a captain and an attorney. They wanted the version of me that was still a girl who didn't know how to say no. I received a package in the mail toward the end of July, a small, poorly wrapped box that had been sent from Columbus with a return address I didn't recognize at first. Inside was a collection of drawings from my niece, Harper Reed, mostly pictures of the zoo we used to visit, and a very detailed sketch of a woman in a green uniform that was supposed to be me. There was a note tucked into the bottom, written in the shaky, uneven print of a 7-year-old, telling me that she was practicing her reading every day and that she hoped I could come home for Thanksgiving because she missed our walks. My sister, Brooks Burke, hadn't signed the note, and there was no message from her in the box, but I knew that the drawings were a bridge being built by the only person in that family who didn't want anything from me but my time. I put the drawings on my refrigerator, right next to my duty roster, and I realized that while I had cut the financial ties that bound me to their mistakes, the emotional ones were still there, frayed, but not entirely broken. My brother-in-law, Jackson Reed, called me a few nights later, his voice sounding exhausted but steadier than it had been during his visit to North Carolina back in June. He told me that he and my sister had officially started a debt management program and that they had sold her SUV to pay off a significant portion of the credit card she had hidden from him for years. He said the marriage was still in a fragile place, a house that had been hollowed out by secrets and was now trying to find a new foundation, but that for the first time in their 7 years together, they were actually talking about the truth. He thanked me again for the way I handled the dinner, telling me that the explosion had been the only thing loud enough to wake him up from the life he was sleepwalking through. We didn't talk about my father or my mother, and we didn't talk about the lottery money. We just talked about the weather and the way the Braves were playing, two people who had survived the same wreck and were trying to figure out how to be friends on the other side. I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the line of the pines, and I thought about the version of me who had sat at that dinner table 3 months ago, terrified of the silence that would follow my no. I realized that the silence wasn't a void. It was a sanctuary. a space where I could finally hear my own thoughts without the constant white noise of someone else's crisis demanding my attention. I had my own home, my own name, and a future that belonged entirely to me. And while the cost had been $87,000 and a relationship with my parents, I knew that I had made the right trade. I wasn't the villain of the story my mother was telling the neighbors, and I wasn't the bank account my sister wanted me to be. I was just a woman who had served her country and was finally, for the first time in 31 years, serving herself. The door to the Cape Cod house was unlocked, and the porch light was on. But I was no longer waiting for the people who had tried to break me to come and tell me I was right. By the time the leaves started to turn a burnt crimson along the trails of Fort Liberty, the last of the legal paperwork arrived in a plain white envelope from the bank. It was a simple notification, devoid of emotion or ceremony, confirming that the refinance was complete and my name had been officially scrubbed from the title of my father's Ford F-150. I sat at my new kitchen table in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and I stared at that piece of paper for a long time, realizing that this was the final thread connecting my financial security to a man who had been willing to gamble it away for his own pride. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, and no final apology. Just the quiet, bureaucratic end to a decade of me paying for a life I wasn't allowed to lead. I tucked the letter into the brown folder with the rest of the evidence, realizing that I had finally closed the ledger on the Burke family's expectations. And for the first time since I stepped off that plane at Pope Army Airfield, I felt like I was actually home. I did one more thing that summer, something I haven't told anyone in my family about and likely never will, because I've learned that the most meaningful acts of kindness are the ones that don't need a witness. I took $30,000 of my remaining lottery winnings and moved it into a 529 college savings plan for my niece, Harper Reed, ensuring that when she turns 18, she won't have to look at her family as a source of debt or a reason to stay small. I kept the account entirely in my name, with her as the sole beneficiary, so that my sister, Brooks Burke, can never touch a single cent of it to pay for a credit card or a bad decision. It's a quiet secret I carry with me, a bridge I've built for a little girl who I hope will one day understand that her aunt didn't leave because she didn't love her, but because she loved her enough to show her what a boundary looks like. Some gifts don't need an audience, and some debts are better paid forward than they are paid back. Let me pause and ask you one last thing. Do you believe that a family can ever truly heal after the truth has been laid bare, or are some bridges just meant to be left behind? If this story has meant something to you, please like, share, and subscribe to help us tell more stories like this. Now, let's continue. According to my Aunt Sarah, my father still sits on that front porch in Ohio every evening, watching the traffic pass and staring at the blue truck that he now has to pay for with his own retirement checks. She told me that he finally stopped telling people I was the villain of the story, not because he found the courage to apologize, but because the pastor's sermon had made the neighbors start asking questions he wasn't prepared to answer. My mother, Elise Burke, still calls me once every 2 weeks, and while she still sighs about the tension in the family, she has stopped asking me for money and has started asking me about my life in the U.S. Army. It's a fragile, superficial kind of peace, a thin layer of ice over a very deep lake, but it's the only version of a relationship we can have right now, without me losing myself in the process. I've accepted that Silas Burke and Elise Burke may never be the parents who walk through my front door without a demand in their hands. But I've also stopped letting that realization keep me from enjoying the life I've built. My sister has never reached out, and as the months turn into a year, I'm finding that the silence she's giving me is actually the greatest gift she's ever offered, because it allows me to breathe without wondering when the next crisis will arrive. I still get photos of my niece from my brother-in-law, Jackson Reed, who told me recently that they have finally moved into a smaller apartment they can actually afford, and that he feels like he's finally waking up from a long, expensive dream. I'm not sure if their marriage will last, or if the Burke family will ever sit at another dinner table without the weight of the $87,000 sitting between us. But I do know that I'm no longer the one carrying the burden of their choices. I'm a captain in the JAG Corps, a homeowner on Elm Street, and a woman who finally learned that the most important mission I would ever have was the one where I decided to save myself. I sat on my front porch last night, watching the fireflies dance in the North Carolina heat, and I realized that I didn't lose my family. I just lost the version of them that required me to be a bank account instead of a person. I looked at the small, sturdy house behind me and the white trim I had painted with my own hands, and I felt a sense of peace that no lottery win could ever buy. I'm not waiting for a phone call, and I'm not looking for a way to fix what they broke, because I've finally realized that a house isn't built of brick and mortar, but of the truth you're willing to tell yourself when the lights are low. My name is Louise Burke. I am 31 years old, and I am finally, for the first time in my life, exactly where I'm supposed to be.